Hey guys, welcome back. Thank you so much. We just hit 100 subscribers. This is super exciting. If you're not subscribed, make sure to hit that subscribe button. It really means a lot to me and it helps motivate me to continue this series. Anyways, today we're going to do something a bit different. Someone just messaged me asking me for help on how to build a tic-tac-toe game. So for today's lesson, let's build a simple project together. So I'll try my best to explain each step thoroughly. I'll cover these steps in more detail later on in the Bootcamp series. Without further ado, let's build a tic-tac-toe game in Python. Before we start, please pause this video and try to solve the problem yourself before continuing. The goal of this video is to show you how to do it, but at the same time, I don't want you to copy the code. I want you to try this out yourself so that way you can build the logical thinking and the problem-solving skills to solve this problem. Okay, so what is tic-tac-toe? Tic-tac-toe is a game played on a grid that's of size 3 by 3. There are 2 players in total, and each player is assigned a mark, either a X or an O. The player with the X is the one to go first. Each player takes turns putting their marks into empty squares. The first player to get 3 of their marks in a row, either vertically, horizontally, or diagonally, is declared the winner. When all 9 squares are marked, the game is over. So before we jump straight into code, we should plan out how we want to approach the problem. This helps us think through the problem and also organize our thoughts into logic. So for this game, the first thing we want to do is probably prompt the user for what mark they want, either an X or an O. Next, we want to display the board to the user. And then we want to prompt player 1 to pick a square to mark. After this, we want to validate the board to see if we have a winner or whether the board is filled. Next, we want to prompt player 2 to pick a square to mark. After this, we want to repeat the previous step and check whether we have a winner or if the board is filled. Now, we want to repeat these steps until we have a winner or a tie. Once we have a winner or tie, the game is basically over. Cool, so now that we have organized our thoughts, it's very easy to see which logic is getting repeated multiple times. For example, prompting a user to pick a square to mark, and also validating the board for a winner or tie. So by planning ahead, we're able to come up with functions that we can reuse throughout our code. In addition, this also helped us plan our game loop, which is basically asking for user input and checking whether there is a winner or a tie. Awesome, so feel free to pause here and try to code this out yourself. Welcome back, I hope that you tried this yourself, but anyways, let's get coding. If you look in the editor, I draw a 3 by 3 grid. So in Python, we can represent this as a 2D list, where each position of the grid can be accessed by a coordinate. So let me mark the rows and columns for you. So basically in programming, we start counting from 0. So let's count 0, 1, and 2. And let's do the same for the columns as well. 0, 1, and 2. So now if I want to access the cell in the middle, it will be in position 1, 1. And if I want to access the last element, it will be 2, 2. So now we can access any position in the grid through a coordinate. So now let's handle the first step, which is basically asking the user what mark they want to use, either an X or an O. To get the user input, all we have to do is type input and then give it a prompt. So let's do please choose X or O. And if you run this code, you're going to see it shows please choose X or O, and then you basically type X or O, and then the program ends. So we want to store this in a variable so that way we know what mark player 1 chose. So let's call this player 1 mark equals input, please choose X or O. So let's check if this actually works. We can do this by doing print player 1 mark. Cool, so let's run this code. Please choose X or O. So if I choose O, you're going to see O, which is basically the input we gave. There's one problem with this code where basically we can enter any character we want. So for example, if we run this code again and I type Z, you're going to see that we get Z, which is not an option of X or O. For now, we can ignore this and we can fix this later on. But for the sake of this tutorial, let's just keep it very simple. So based on what player 1 chooses, we have to figure out what player 2 gets. So we can just do this with a simple if statement. So we just check if player 1 mark equals X, then player 2 mark equals O. Else, player 2 mark equals X. All we're doing here is assign what mark to give player 2. So now let's also check if this works. So let's print player 1 mark and player 2 mark. So let's run this code. So I'm going to choose X, and we should see X and O. And now let's try O. So if I put O, I'm going to get O and X. So this is working as expected. So next we have to create the board. All we have to do is create a variable to store the board. So let's call it board. And then at first, let's create an empty list. And now let's fill this list in with the rows. So we could do this with a simple loop for row in range 3. So we use 3 here because we have 3 rows in total. Next, we have to do board.append. And let's represent a empty cell with an empty string. So here we could just do empty string. And then what we can do is multiply this by 3 because there are 3 columns in total. And basically this will just give us a list of 3 empty strings. Cool. So now to test whether this works, we could just print the board out. Print board. And now let's run the code. And okay, let's enter X. And then here we see the board. Unfortunately, it does not look like the one above. So if we want to format it that way, what we can do is we can use a loop to print out each row. So to do that, it's very simple. Just do for row in range 3, print board row. And now if we run this code, we're going to see, okay, enter X again. And now we'll see the board formatted correctly. So what we have here is a basic loop that goes through the range of 3. And then we're going through the board and grabbing each row by the index. So in this case, 0, 1, and 2. And that's how we print out the board like this. Now we need to prompt player 1 to pick a square to mark. Let's keep this simple and ask for 2 inputs, the row and the column. Let's create a variable input row equals input please pick a row. And then let's copy this and do the same for a column. So now we can just do input column. And then now we say, please pick a column. Cool. So now that we have the row and the column, all we have to do is validate that it's a possible move. So let's create a function called define is valid. And this takes a row and a column. So let's write a if row greater than equals 0 and row is less than 3. And then we also want to check if column is greater than equals 0 and column less than 3. So what we're doing here is we're validating that the row is greater than 0 because the first row is at 0. And we also want to verify that the last row is less than 3 because our grid is only of size 3. And we want to do the same for the columns as well. To keep our code clean, we can use a not statement to negate this condition. So we can just add a not and then we open the brackets for the statement. So now we can just return false early. Next, we want to check if that square is empty. This is simple. All we need to do is return board row column equals empty string. And if this is true, this means that this is a valid move. Let's test out our code now. Let's do a print is valid on the input row and the input column. Let's run this code. So let's choose an X or O. And then let's pick our row. So let's put 0 and then 0. And then now we get an error. More than equal, not supported between instances of string and int. We get this error because the inputted value is of type string and we're comparing with the values 0 and 3, which are integers. To fix this, all we have to do is cast the string value to an integer. So we can just do int input row and also int input column. Cool. So now let's run the code. So let's go X and then let's pick 0, 0. And now we get true because it's a valid move. Let's try it on something invalid. So let's run the code. Let's do O this time. And then let's put 3, 3. And now we get false because now we are outside of our grid. Next, we want to keep prompting the user if they gave us an incorrect input. So let's create a function called player make move. Define player make move. And let's put the player as the first parameter. And now let's move the input logic inside this function. So we have the input row, input column. Then erase this. And then we keep the is valid. And then next we want to take this and put it inside here as well. So we want to put this inside a while loop. So that way we can keep prompting the user until we get a valid input. So let's create a variable to track whether the condition is met. So let's create a variable is valid move and set it to false. So now we can do while not is valid move, we can prompt the user for a input row and column, and then basically we update is valid move to equal is valid. Once we get a valid move, this condition is met and the loop ends. So now that we have a valid coordinate, we can update that square. So let's do board input row and input column and just set it to the player, where basically the player represents the mark that they are assigned. So actually I think we should rename player to mark to make this code make more sense. So let's do mark and mark. So let's test this out by calling our function player make move player one mark, and then let's display the board after. So let's copy this code and put it here, and now let's run our code. Let's choose X and then let's pick a row. So in this case let's do 0 and 0, and now we get another error. So it's saying list indexes must be integers or slices, not string. Okay, so now we have this error again with this integer. So what we should do is, instead of doing the cast here, let's just do it on the input itself. So let's get rid of that and let's put int here and int here. Cool, so now let's run the code again. Let's choose X 0 0, and now as you can see we place the X up here. Now let's try an invalid input. Let's click run, let's choose X, let's choose row 3 3, and then you see how it says please pick a row again. I guess what we can do is tell the user that they gave an invalid input, so that way it's more clear. So let's add a print statement here in the case where they entered an invalid input. So we can do if not is valid move, we can just do print please enter a valid input. And now let's run again. Let's choose X and then let's choose 3 3. Now you see how it says please enter a valid input. So now we can just put 1 and then 2, and then you see that we have an X here. Cool. Next, all we have to do is ask player 2 to make their move. So now we can just copy this line and put it here and just change this to a 2 and move this back one space. And then after that, we can just print the board again. So now let's hit run. And now let's choose X. Okay, so I want to go 0 0, and now I want to go 0 1. And as you can see, there's an X and a 0. Cool, so we're almost done, but we forgot to do one important step. We forgot to check whether there is a winner and whether the game is over. So let's start with checking for the winner. Let's create a function called checkWinner. Define checkWinner. So for tic-tac-toe, we have to check horizontal, vertical, and diagonal. So for the sake of time, I implemented how to check for the winner. So basically, I created a function to handle the horizontal, the vertical, and the diagonal. So let's run through the code together. So let's start with horizontal. So we scroll up. So basically what I do for horizontal is I loop through each row. I basically grab the mark for the first column, and then I check whether it's empty. If it's empty, we don't need to do anything because we can't get a match at all with an empty square. And then next, we start our matches with 1 because we already have the first mark. So we go through each column, skipping the first one, going up to the index 2. And we check whether that square matches the mark. If it's a match, we increment our matches. And then at the end, we just check whether we have 3 matches in total. And if we do, we return true. And after looping through all the rows, if we don't find anything, we just return a false. Next, for vertical, it's basically the same logic again. This time, we go through the columns first, and then we grab the first row, and then we check if it's an empty mark. If it is, we continue. And if it's not, we start our matches at 1, and then we go through each column, and we skip the first one, and we go up to the index 2. And basically we check if there's a match. If there is, we increment, and if we have 3 matches, we return true. And if we don't find anything at all, we return false. Next, we have diagonal, which is a bit different. I created 2 functions here to reduce duplicated code. Basically how this works is I give it a starting point. So in this case, 0 0 will start at the top left corner. And then I tell it I want to increment by 1 each time. For this case, we grab the mark in position 0, 0, and we check if it's empty. If it's empty, we can return false right away. And then we do the same logic with the matches, and then we only have to go through 2 positions, so that's why we go through a loop of range 2. And since we're going downwards, we only have to add 1 to the row and the column. And then basically we check if there's a match, and if there is a match, we increment, and finally we just return whether we have 3 matches in total. And for the other case, we start in the top right corner, and in this case, we have to decrement by 1 to go backwards. And it basically runs through the same logic, and that's how we check for a winner in Tic-Tac-Toe. Cool, so the last thing we need to do now is to check whether the board is full. We can do this by creating another function, so let's just call it define check board filled. And all we want to do is basically loop through each cell within the board and check if there is an empty cell. So we can just do for row in range 3 and for column in range 3, if board row column equals empty string, we can return false. And if we don't see any empty strings at all, and then we can just return true because there are no more possible moves on this board. Cool, so now we have all of the logic for our game. All we need to do now is create our game loop. So let's use a while loop for this. While true. Before we fill in the code, let's write out the skeleton. So first we have player 1 makes a move. Then we want to display the board. Next we want to check for the winner. And then we want to check if the board is filled. And then after that, we want to repeat these steps as well for player 2. So let's copy and paste this. And now we have the same thing for player 2. Looking at the skeleton, we can see that these 3 steps, display the board, check for the winner, and check if the board is filled, is repeated. So here we can also refactor this code again. Hence, we can put the player moves inside a loop. So let's do for mark in player 1 mark and player 2 mark. So let's copy the code over. So let's grab this code and remove it. Let's add it into our loop. So now we can do player make move for the mark. And then for here, we want to display the board. So now we want to check for the winner. So if check winner is true, we just want to print mark wins. And then we want to break out of our loop. And then we can get rid of this line, and then this line. And then we also want to check if the board is filled as well. So we can just copy if check board is filled, then basically here, we just want to break and also print game over. So now we can get rid of everything at the bottom. Before we play the game, let's clean up the code. Let's go to the top. Cool, so before we play the game, let's wrap this inside a function. So let's do define TicTacToe, and then let's move everything over. So now, instead of breaking, we should just return to exit out of the function. And now all we have to do is just call TicTacToe. And now let's click run. Okay, let's choose X. I pick row 0, 0, 1, 0. Oh shoot, so 1, 1, and then I pick 0, 1, and then the last one should be 2, 2, and there we go, X wins. Cool, so that's basically how you build a tic-tac-toe game. I hope that you learned something new. Sorry for the long video, I didn't solve the problem beforehand, so I was doing everything live. I did this on purpose because I wanted to show you guys how I thought through the problem, how I refactored the code, and how I fixed errors. If I just copied and pasted code over, you guys wouldn't have seen the real process of solving a problem. So please let me know what you think about this video style, and if you have any questions, feel free to leave it in the comments below. Make sure to like this video and subscribe for more content.